The door opened with a tired chime, that kind that didn't so much ring as it sighed. The Tuesday morning lobby was already half filled, a retired couple slowly counting checks, a mother juggling a toddler and a diaper bag, the faint hiss of a receipt printer filling in the quiet spaces. Nothing urgent happened here. Everything moved with the soft drag of time. James Hart stepped into that space like a man walking onto sacred ground. He paused after just 2 steps, taking in the room. His shoulders were drawn back, his steps measured, not with pride, but because if he rushed, his right knee would lock. A soft limp betrayed decades-old shrapnel. Nobody noticed. He wore an old brown overcoat, sleeves just slightly too long, and under it, a collared shirt neatly pressed that morning with careful hands. On his chest, partially visible under the lapel, 3 ribbons peeked from a time too few cared to remember. He clutched a canvas folder to his chest, frayed soft at the corners, filled with his DD-214, a worn Social Security card, and a folded letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The line moved slowly, and James didn't mind. He took comfort in slow-moving things. In fact, most things had slowed down for him. Not just his steps, but calls from friends, visits from neighbors, even the postman's knock. That morning, his only appointment was this, a routine withdrawal of his monthly pension. He stood in line, still, quiet. The fluorescent light flickered softly above him. His eyes wandered, settling on a child across the room. A little girl holding a toy rabbit, wide-eyed and watching him. She waved. He gave a small nod back, the only one who saw him. When he reached the counter, the teller was young, maybe 24, polite but distant. She asked for his ID, then stared at his paperwork, brows knitting slightly. James offered it all without complaint, setting it on the counter with the dignity of a man offering proof of something sacred. The teller paused. "I'm going to need to have our branch manager take a look at this," she said. Not coldly, but not kindly either. "There's a new policy about verifying older veteran benefits." "Just a moment." James nodded. He'd heard about policies. They were like shadows, always shifting, always cold. He stepped back as instructed. Behind him, the quiet murmur of customers picked up. A man in his mid-30s, Kyle, blue blazer, wireless earbuds, phone in hand, leaned toward another woman and said, "Just loud enough? Can you believe that? Half these guys probably just download fake documents online now." James heard it. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed steady on the floor, where light pooled over the waxed linoleum. His fingers tightened slightly around the canvas folder. He remembered the jungle, the stink of oil and blood, the silence before an ambush. Back then, you earned quiet. Now it was given for the wrong reasons. The manager arrived, a man in his 40s, clean-cut, cautious. He reviewed the documents, asked James to confirm his name and date of service. When James answered, the man hesitated, then offered a tight smile. "You understand, we've had some misrepresentations lately." "Just doing our due diligence." James offered no resistance. "I served in the 9th Engineer Battalion, Vietnam, 68 through 70. My discharge was honorable. The VA signed off on these papers more times than I can count." His voice was calm, but beneath it, something warbled. A flicker of exhaustion, of indignity too often swallowed. He was asked to step aside again. Security had been informed, not urgently, just in case. The room had changed. The child with the rabbit had stopped waving. The mother now pulled her close. Kyle had opened his phone camera. Online clout was currency, and James Hart, 78, was becoming a headline. And then, the chime rang again. The door opened, and through it walked a man in full-dress uniform, his shoes shining like obsidian, medals glinting against his chest. General Samuel Klein. James looked up, his breath caught. "Sam?" A single word slipped from his lips, not in fear, but memory. The room hadn't recognized him, but he had. The hum of the bank grew louder, not in volume but in pressure. Conversations continued. but glanced off him like rain on stone. James stood in his little square of polished floor, alone among dozens, a ghost with paperwork. Not even a seat was offered. Across the room, Kyle adjusted his blazer and leaned against a marble pillar, thumbs working over his phone. The screen lit his face with false confidence. "Stolen valor caught on camera," he muttered into the lens, panning briefly toward James. No malice, just thoughtless spectacle. James didn't look up. His gaze rested on the old wooden clock above the customer service desk. The second hand ticked with mechanical certainty, each tick a reminder that respect could be eroded one moment at a time. He shifted his weight. The knee protested. A flicker in his mind. The jungle again. Early morning. Mud-soaked boots. The smell of gun oil and mildew. Time moved differently back then. Every step might be the last. Every breath was counted. He remembered watching a watch's second hand back then too, hoping it wouldn't be his last. A deep voice echoed from behind the counter. "Sir, please be patient while we verify the documents." It wasn't cruel, just tired, procedural. James gave a small nod. That same nod he'd used decades ago when told to wait in a dusty outpost while decisions were made elsewhere. He clutched the canvas folder tighter. Inside was everything he had to prove who he was. Proof of things that should not have needed proving, because they were carried not in ink, but in silence and scars. A teller laughed at something another customer said. Life went on. Children squirmed in line. A man argued softly about an overdraft. All the while, James stood like a man pinned under a spotlight that only he could feel. To those in the room, he was just an inconvenience, another wrinkle in the system. But within James, the decades stirred, a history not written in books, but worn into muscle, seared into memory. No one asked. No one ever did. Kyle watched James again. Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe. He lowered his phone slightly. A moment passed. Then he opened his camera again. The screen showed James's stillness. Kyle whispered, "He's not even saying anything." James could have said so much. He could have told them about the boy he carried through the mud, both their legs torn by shrapnel, about the bridge built under sniper fire, about letters home never answered. But he didn't. His eyes wandered again to the little girl. She looked at him still, curious, not afraid. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, and in a voice too low to carry, whispered something. The mother hushed her, but the moment lingered. A wind seemed to shift in James's chest. The ache wasn't just physical. It was something heavier. A weariness born not from one morning, but from 1,000 silent moments like this one. Invisible erosion. He looked down at his coat. The stitches near the elbow were his own, done late at night under a yellow bulb, hands shaking slightly. He could mend cloth, but mending dignity was slower work. The bank clock ticked again. Another second passed, then another. Time, indifferent, moved forward. But James stayed still, rooted in a place that no longer remembered how to see him. Then the door opened, and everything began to change. The chime above the door rang again. Soft, familiar, but this time it carried weight, not louder than before, but heavier somehow. James turned instinctively, as did others, though their attention barely lingered. He saw the shoes first, glossed black leather, sharp as glass, moving with purpose. Then the hem of the dark blue uniform, pressed, precise, shoulders broad, medals glinting not for decoration, but as echoes of places too few remembered. The man's presence was undeniable. Authority walked in with him. James's breath caught, not just from recognition, but from the years that collapsed in his chest. The uniform didn't just belong to any officer. It belonged to someone he had once known, not as a man, but as a boy. Samuel Klein. The name swelled in his memory before it reached his lips. Not General, not Sir, just Sam, a scared 19-year-old kid from Michigan who used to write his sister every night, afraid he'd never see her again. the one James had pulled from the dirt, bleeding and crying. Sam stopped mid-step, scanning the room like a man who could sense tension before hearing it. His eyes landed on James, not by accident, but as if drawn by a signal only the two of them could hear. Their eyes locked. James saw it, the sudden falter in Klein's expression, a blink, a flicker of memory surfacing behind the seasoned calm of a man who'd seen command rooms and battlegrounds alike. In that moment, the bank faded. The chatter dulled. There were only two men, and 50 years between them. Sam stepped forward, slow, deliberate. His boots echoed once on the polished tile. "Is there a reason you're treating Sergeant Hart like a liar?" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The tone, crisp, clipped, razor clean, sliced the air. Silence followed instantly, as if the building itself had drawn breath and held it. The manager stammered. We're just following verification." "Of what?" Klein's voice cut gently. "Of whether the man who carried me out of a minefield is telling the truth." Whispers began in the corners of the room. Kyle slowly lowered his phone. The teller froze, mouth half open, cheeks reddening. The security guard at James's side stepped back, instinctively straightening. James said nothing. His eyes were glassy now. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his wife passed, not at his best friend's funeral, not even when his body first betrayed him, and he had to give up driving. But now, standing in the middle of a bank, in front of a man whose life had once rested in his hands, his throat clenched with something old and sacred. Klein took another step. "This man is Sergeant First Class James Hart, 9th Engineer Battalion, 1968 through 1970. I know because I owe him my life, and my legs, and the chance to become the man you see now." He turned to James, his voice gentler. "You remember me?" James's lips barely moved, but the words carried weight. "How could I forget?" Sam smiled, but it was the kind of smile men give when they're holding back emotion too tightly to speak. He removed his cap, slow, deliberate, and held it to his chest. The bank remained still, frozen, awash in the echo of a moment that had taken 50 years to arrive. And yet, standing there with his chest rising slow, his shoulders squared not from pride but from memory, James Hart didn't feel forgotten anymore. The bank had never been quieter. It wasn't just the hush of held breath. It was the stillness of recognition seeping into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. A room full of strangers suddenly found themselves part of a story they hadn't earned but could no longer ignore. Kyle took a step back, phone slack in his hand. He looked down at the recording still playing on his screen, the image of James standing alone just moments ago, face downturned, shoulders slightly trembling. It played like guilt. He pressed stop. The teller, now pale and blinking fast, began gathering James's documents again, her hands shaking slightly. She whispered something. Maybe, "I'm sorry," maybe not. But it didn't matter. The apology had missed its moment. James hadn't moved, still holding the canvas folder, still wearing the same coat, still carrying the same quiet. But something inside him had shifted. His spine felt straighter. Not out of ego, but out of gravity, as though the shame had been lifted, if only slightly, by an old name spoken with reverence. Brigadier General Klein hadn't stepped back. He remained beside James, still holding his cap to his chest, still watching the others. Not with condemnation, but with calm disappointment. He didn't need to raise his voice to make the room feel smaller. The child, the same girl with the toy rabbit, tugged her mother's sleeve again. Her eyes were locked on James. "Is he a hero?" she whispered. Her mother, unsure, glanced at James, then at the general. She nodded once, slowly. The girl stepped forward, small shoes tapping softly against the tile. She approached James without fear, just the honest curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned how to look away. James looked down at her. Their eyes met. She held her toy rabbit tightly and said, softly but clearly, "Thank you for your service." It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't dramatic. Just a line she'd heard once in a movie, A scene where soldiers stepped off a plane and someone waiting with a flag said those same words. But now she knew what they meant. James didn't reply. Couldn't. The words found a place in him that hadn't heard such honesty in decades. The silence that followed the girl's words didn't end. It deepened. General Klein turned slightly, just enough to face the center of the room. His expression didn't change. Still firm, still unreadable, but his hands moved with purpose. One reached up and in a slow, deliberate motion, he placed his cap back on, squared his shoulders, and took a single step back. Then, in front of everyone, the teller, the manager, the recording phones, the skeptical eyes, he lifted his right hand in a crisp, perfect salute. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't for show. It was for one man only. James' heart stood frozen. He hadn't been saluted in years, not like this. Not by a man whose name had once been shouted by terrified medics in the jungle. A breath caught in his chest. He wanted to return it. Had to return it. His right arm ached from the weight of time, his knee trembling beneath him. But slowly, he shifted. His cane slipped slightly, but the general caught his elbow, steadied him just enough, then stepped away to let him do it on his own. And he did. The salute wasn't crisp. It shook slightly, but it was no less honorable, perhaps more so. It was a gesture not of posture, but of pain endured and duty never abandoned. The entire bank stood still. Phones lowered. Hats came off. Even Kyle, now ghostly pale, watched with something resembling reverence in his eyes. Across the room, the little girl held her toy rabbit tighter. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. James's salute held. So did the general's, for 5 seconds, then 10. Time didn't move. And when the salutes dropped, they dropped like a curtain at the end of a long-forgotten play. Quiet. Final. Respected. The manager tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words formed. He nodded instead, swallowing hard. General Klein reached for the canvas folder on the counter and handed it back to James without a word. They stood side by side again. No more needing to prove anything. No more questions. Just two soldiers. One salute. And a room that would never forget what it had just witnessed. They left without fanfare. No applause followed them. No one rushed forward to shake hands or take photos. The world outside the bank was still just Ohio in late spring. Breeze whispering through parking lot flags. The distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Life, unaware it had paused for something sacred, resumed. General Klein matched James's slow pace without a word. He didn't offer to carry the folder. He didn't ask if James needed help. He simply walked with him, step for step, like he once had, limping together through another kind of mud, another kind of silence. The sidewalk cracked in places. Weeds poked through seams. James walked with the practiced care of someone who knew every uneven slab by memory. He nodded at a passing mail carrier, who offered a polite but puzzled glance at the two older men moving in quiet rhythm. After a few blocks, James finally spoke. "I thought you were dead, Sam." The general chuckled, soft, gravelly. "A few times I thought the same. But you dragged me out, remember?" James looked ahead. "I remember a lot of things. Most of them I try not to." They passed a corner where an American flag hung from a rusted bracket, its edges fraying but still proud. Klein nodded at it, almost reflexively. "I've been working on a foundation," he said after a moment. "Helps guys like us, quiet ones. I had a form to notarize. That's why I came to the bank today." James smiled at that. "Guess it was the right Tuesday." Klein stopped walking. No, it was the right lifetime. They stood on the sidewalk, traffic whispering by in the distance. A dog barked from someone's yard. A boy rode past on a bike, headphones in, unaware that he passed two men who had once carried the weight of an entire generation's burden. James glanced sideways. "You really never forgot?" Klein shook his head. "You carried me out." I screamed. "I bled all over your back. You said, 'I've got you, kid.' I heard those words every time I thought I wouldn't make it." James's throat tightened, but he said nothing. "And when I did make it," Klein continued, "I built something so I could carry others. It was the only way I could repay that moment." They resumed walking, slower now. There was no rush. At the edge of James's neighborhood, the general stopped. "Mind if I visit again sometime?" James nodded, his voice thin but certain. "You already did. But yeah, I'd like that." As the general turned to go, the little girl's voice echoed again in James's mind. "Thank you for your service." And for the first time in years, James' heart felt like maybe the service had been seen. Night came quickly in the jungle. One moment, it was humid daylight. The next, the sky dripped into blackness, and the trees swallowed every scrap of sound except for the rasp of breath and the distant crackle of danger. James crouched beside the boy, their backs pressed against a tree slick with moisture and fear. The boy, Private Samuel Klein, couldn't stop shaking. Blood ran from his left calf, not in torrents, but in steady pulses. Shrapnel, James thought, maybe bone deep. The kid was pale, younger than he'd seemed in the briefing tent. 18, maybe 19, barely old enough to grow stubble, too young to die. "Breathe, kid," James whispered, voice low, steady. Klein gasped. "It hurts. I can't feel my toes." "Are they gone?" James reached over, checking with fingers trained to feel through chaos. "They're there. Foot still yours." A whimper. Not shameful, just honest. It was a sound James had heard too many times, from too many good men. Mortars had hit the tree line an hour ago. The platoon was scattered, the radio useless. It was just them now. Two men in a world that had already decided it was done being merciful. James tore the sleeve from his uniform, wrapped the boy's leg as tightly as he could. He knew it wouldn't last, but it had to last long enough. "You hear me, Sam?" he said, crouching low. "You stay awake. That's an order." Klein nodded weakly. James paused, then leaned in close, voice firm. "I'm not leaving you here. I've got you." The boy looked at him then, not with trust, not with fear, but with something deeper, a kind of hope that lives only in moments when all other light is gone. James hoisted him up, not gently, not cleanly, but with the muscle memory of a man who'd carried heavier things. Equipment, friends, coffins. Klein's arm draped over his shoulder. Each step forward was a battle, but they moved. 1 mile, then 2. Somewhere behind them, the fire still burned. The sky lit briefly with explosions. They didn't look back. When they reached the clearing, James collapsed beside him, coughing smoke. The medics took over. Klein was still crying, gripping James's hand so tight it turned white. "I didn't want to die," the boy whispered. "You didn't," James said. "You won't." The memory flickered. Back in the present, James sat alone in his small kitchen, the overhead light buzzing faintly above. The folded canvas folder rested on the table. His old uniform jacket, freshly brushed, hung on the back of the chair. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to revisit that night, not with dread, but with something closer to reverence. The boy had lived, and now, a lifetime later, that boy had stood before the world and remembered. Not just the moment, not just the man, but the duty. The girl's words had traveled farther than anyone realized. By that evening, the moment at the bank, 2 salutes, 1 uniform, and a little voice saying, "Thank you for your service," had made its way to a dozen phones, a few whispers, and eventually to a small corner of the local news. Not viral, not explosive, just steady, like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. But for James' heart, none of that mattered. He sat by the window as the sun dipped behind the row of pines across the street, the last of the day's warmth brushing against his hand. On the table in front of him sat a folded napkin, a cup of cooling coffee, and the girl's voice echoing in memory. "Thank you for your service." She hadn't said it for anyone else, not for cameras or credit. She said it the way children say what they've been taught, not knowing the weight of the words, only that they're supposed to matter. And they did. It had taken just a sentence to soften decades of silence, to thread meaning into years where none had been offered, for all the ceremonies he'd never been invited to, the speeches made by others, the folded flags handed to younger men. That child had given him something far rarer: recognition, unasked, unrehearsed. Across town, Kyle sat alone in his apartment, watching the video again, the one he'd nearly posted in anger. But now it sat unsent in his gallery. In the footage, you could see James being escorted aside. You could hear Kyle's own voice, skeptical, biting. Then, the door chime, the general's entrance, the salutes, and that girl. Kyle stared at her in the video, her small frame, her rabbit in one hand, her words clear despite the noise. He didn't delete the video. He saved it, not to post, just to keep. A reminder. In another home, the girl's mother sat at the dinner table with her daughter, smiling quietly, as her child proudly told the story again to her grandfather over FaceTime. He was standing there and nobody believed him. But I said thank you, just like the movie said. Her grandfather's eyes softened. You did the right thing, sweetheart. Not everyone does. Across these lives, James, Kyle, the girl, the moment lived on. Small, perhaps, but powerful. Because in her voice lived a truth older than the war James fought, older than the medals in his drawer. A truth passed from generation to generation, that peace is bought, that freedom has faces, and that the least we can do is remember to say, thank you. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor, sacrifice, and quiet courage. Let us know where you're watching from, and comment below to honor a veteran or silent hero in your life. The best way to preserve their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another forgotten chapter of valor, one story at a time.